not talking so much about certainties as about risks which no modern society really should be willing to bear. It's almost as though one were playing Russian roulette and there were a 20-chamber gun with 5 different kinds of bullets. One question could be, what kind of bullet is it that's going to get you? It seems to me a more appropriate question is, do we even want to play Russian roulette?
Is there an alternative to Russian roulette? Is it possible to produce a stable world? Were there policies which would create equilibrium, a balanced world? They found that if you controlled everything, including industrial production, no crisis emerged. But this assumes that we will stop getting richer.
Population was stabilized by effective birth control from 1975. Food production is stabilized using modern techniques at a high level. The key factor, industrial growth, was leveled off in 1975 too, enabling pollution, also carefully controlled, to be kept within bounds. Resources carefully used are falling gradually.
When these are implemented in 1970, we see that the world system is capable of moving into an equilibrium society, a stable state system, which can be sustained as long as we analyze it through the computer.
What is being suggested is that the only way to ensure the future for our grandchildren is to stop getting richer. Only then will there be the resources and the unpolluted world that they will need to survive.
The classic assumption that economic growth was what society had to do is being proven wrong. It is obvious that our instabilities are caused by this endless attempt to increase output, call it just output. Now, our attempts have got to be directed to looking after people who haven't got anything and to reorganizing our own society so that it doesn't have this built-in instability, which we now have because of the growth phenomenon.
But we expect to get richer. Growth promises a better tomorrow. We all, the trade unionists, the politician, the businessman, all expect growth. But because we expect more, we are careless with what we have. Much of it we junk.
70% of this tip should not be here. Here are the metals that we grow short of. Here is the oil we transformed into plastic. Here ends the forest we turned into paper.
Resources our children may need, used to wrap up our food, to pretty our shopping.
Nor has wealth solved many of our social problems. Tempted by the trivia of affluence, there's not enough money for housing or the poor.
Often old ecologically sound things like soap, wool and glass have been replaced by detergents, synthetic fibers and plastics. The new ways not only pollute, but use up resources we cannot replace. Detergents, for example, pollute rivers and use up oil.
The benefits of growth are obvious, the costs obscure. At first, growth seems fine. Take the motor car, for example. Motor cars provide an escape route from the concrete cities into the countryside. They have provided millions with the opportunity to travel, to explore, visit their friends, widen their horizons.
Too many cars have destroyed the very freedom that the motor car gave us. Now there's only 65 yards of road for each of Britain's motor cars. London's motorway plan will cost 2,000 million. That money could house 2.5 million people and build 200 new schools. Lead is a scarce metal. 40% of the world's lead production is added to petrol.
A quarter of London is road.
Vehicles produce 60% of our air pollution.
Half of our children will have a car accident.
Each year, accidents cost £320 million and 7,000 lives.
A car driven from Land's End to John O'Groats uses as much oxygen as a man in a lifetime.
To manufacture a car requires 100,000 gallons of water. Each of these cars has used 2,500 pounds of steel, 54 pounds of zinc, 51 pounds of lead, 32 pounds of copper, and some aluminium.
When the study talks of equilibrium, it is talking about halting this kind of growth, the kind that consumes resources and pollutes the environment. But what would equilibrium be like for people?
I think it could be extremely pleasant. We're not suggesting a deterioration of material standards as being necessary to an extent which should in fact frighten many people. Many things can be organized a great deal better materially now. For example, the cluttering of cities with cars, its disadvantages as great as its advantages. But I think that there is the world has the possibilities with a little better distribution and organization of providing a decent life with flexibility and freedom for people. But with enormous possibilities of leisure, social development, artistic development, I think it could easily be a much, much richer life than we have today.
There's going to have to be a shift away from an emphasis on material goods to one on the social services. There has to be a shift which views man as part of a total system rather than as man, a person who has been given a system for his exploitation.
But the idea and dynamic of growth are deeply embedded in society. To stop it challenges some of the basic assumptions we make about ourselves and the world we live in.
Business is firmly based on the assumption of growth. To produce profit, to reinvest, and grow is quite literally its business.
Come on, you went out, sell 900. Anyone do that?
I want to sell 600.
250 for sale.
The poor of the world look to economic growth for a way out of their poverty and their starvation.
And for us, in the West, it gives us the increasing standard of living we've grown to expect. Our science and technology, too, have been harnessed in the service of growth.
Can such powerful drives, economic and political, social and personal, that support the idea of growth, be redirected? What kind of changes must be made in our economic system, in our politics, in our minds? How do we organize the world without growth?
What must we change? Growth since the war has been created by improved technologies. They have provided us with cheaper goods and industrialists with larger profits. But the impact of science was one-sided. Most ecologists, including those with reservations about the study, agree on this.
Most of the ecological difficulties that we face in the United States, and I'm sure it's true in Britain too, have developed as a result of technological transformation since World War II. This is the period in which the environmental crisis has become so intense. Now, during that period, the U.S. and I think also Britain engaged in a very intense research program in biology and medicine, of unprecedented size and intensity. And so here we were with an unprecedented research effort in biology, and all the while the biological system on which we depend was being degraded without our being aware of it.
Scientists were taking apart the world and looking at the parts. Industry, technology, took that knowledge and exploited it. But nobody was looking at what was happening to the whole system, at what the effect of these changes would eventually be. It was, quite simply, nobody's job.
The main thing, I think, is that it's the dismemberment of science into isolated specialties and their failure to develop, so to speak, a complex pattern which matches the complexity of nature, which has kept science rather isolated from a problem like the environmental crisis, where nature exists as a whole.
Do we need a science that looks less at the way things are and more at the way that they relate and change?
Can we create a technology consistent with nature?
When we talk about shifting to equilibrium, we're not talking about shifting to a state which will lock in the poorer areas to a permanently inferior status. I personally don't believe there's any possibility of having a viable long-term solution which leaves such glaring disequalities.
Well, we must expect the third world to fight for their share of the cake. It is completely absurd to think that they are going to stop growing when they haven't got a thing. So I believe that unless the rich part of the world makes a careful plan and begins to spend real money in adjusting the balance between the two, there will be absolute uproar, and I mean physical violence. It's inevitable unless these plans are made.
Our development has proved unstable. What form will their development now take?
And if equilibrium means equality between nations, does it mean more equality within nations?
Well, this is going to be a very difficult one because businesses have always gone ahead on the assumption that they're going to be bigger and more profitable than last year. And I don't think that this can possibly go on. And businesses have got to stabilize themselves along with everything else in society.
My feeling is that since environmental analysis, along with many other things, reveals, to me anyway, that the private enterprise system is simply incapable of staying off a suicidal course, that the system will simply have to be changed.
Bill Marsh! Quoting sides on Bowman, Common, and Preferred.
Can business as we know it survive the transition?
On what? Common? Preferred?
If so, how will it be changed?
If not, what will replace it?
At 9, last 7 8. Burgess, 3858. How about Wells Fargo?
So what do we do about population? How will we control our desires to have children?
How do we change the idea that population control is for other people, usually the poor?
Today the economy has to grow by about 2% just to keep people in work. Without growth, there will be less work of the kind we do today. Work, for good or bad, is what most people now do most of the time. In the stable state, work will become much less important.
A lot of things like this have got to change. I think that it's high time we gave up the Puritan notion that work is the only good and found ways of organizing society so that people could do more or less what they wanted. After all, automation will take care of work if you plan it that way.
There might be more subtle changes, With less work, with fewer children, with different patterns of consumption, family life might change. To conserve resources, things like motor cars and washing machines might be shared by larger groups of people.
I'd like to see people experimenting with, communes, things of this kind, because unless we make those experiments, we are not going to be able to adjust to this different kind of world.
It's important, I think, to realize when we talk about this stable state that describes a large number of possible alternatives. We're not talking about some uniform society which would blanket the globe. Certainly not talking about that type of uniformity. We're talking about a system in which the various balances between material output and population can be engineered more or less to suit the particular objectives of a society.
Equilibrium will be a very different world. It could also be a very varied world, a world with all kinds of societies. But they will all be societies radically different from ours. If it is right, then this study forewarns us of a watershed in human history.
It's wholly revolutionary in its very nature. Hitherto, we've had revolutions thrust upon us by people who couldn't stand it any longer, and then there is bloodshed and all sorts of horrors. Now, we now know, I contend, that we have to have a revolution, and we ought to be able to plan it.
Let's not overlook the fact that human society has gone through a number of revolutions in their implications, even perhaps more profound than the one we're talking about today. Just at the dawn of history, of man's history, we saw a transformation from hunting and gathering and nomadism to settled agriculture. The impact of that on man's religion, on his institutions, on his view of himself, were enormously profound. The shift from rural to industrialized man has been an enormous change. The shift from a primarily agricultural to a primarily urban population has had an enormous impact.
Our own society reflects its origins, the Industrial Revolution. That revolution molded our institutions, changed our politics, and shaped our lives. The Stability Revolution, the Equilibrium Revolution, whatever future historians choose to call it, will also shape and change the way we live.
The study has a sting in its tail. We're short of time. We have to act soon to keep our options open. This study and others show that there's a point beyond which it is difficult to pull back from disaster.
Now, I'm a layman, but I've received a lot of scientific evidence, and my impression of that evidence is clearly that the decisions which man takes in the next decade or two, this coming generation, are really going to determine his future. So many of these things are going to be difficult, if not impossible, to reverse if we are not prepared to face them and to reorient our activities and our attitudes on a global scale. And I think that is possible, but it's probably the biggest single task that mankind has ever faced.
We can maintain for ourselves today a very much higher material standard of living, but at a cost, very likely, of decreasing the options which exist for people 50 or 100 years from now, our children and our grandchildren. So this dilemma between satisfying needs in the short term and satisfying them over the long term is perhaps the most fundamental one that comes out.
If that is the case, then what can we do now?
It's important that everyone should have a concept of the world as a whole and should avoid as far as possible bringing up their children in any sense of local patriotism, nationalism, and parochialism.
It's important for you, I think, to realize that you have really the right only to have 2 children, to expect that you're going to have to make short-term sacrifices if they're to have a decent environment and the resources necessary to pursue the kind of life that they should have.
First of all, inform yourself. First of all, become interested. Then let your political leaders, both locally and nationally, know that you're interested and show them that you're informed. then look at your own habits as consumers, as producers, and the things that you do in your daily life, and ask yourself what effect they're having on the whole problem. Are they making a positive contribution, or are you part of the problem?
Is it necessary to buy the kinds of products that you do? And isn't it possible, perhaps, to use them somewhat longer and slow down the flow of material goods through your household?
This transition from the present type of society for the new society, which will be balanced with its environment and within, depends on all of us, on all of you. And that will require political action.
Men, for the first time in the history of man, have the opportunity to design the society they want and the resources to put that into effect. Now, that is the guts of the matter to me. We have to think out just what society do we want. We can have it, you know.
We have to imagine what world we would like.
Perhaps, it seems, our children could live our dreams.
Imagine no possession. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, or brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world